In the summer of 1998, I was 13 years old. And a month after becoming bar mitzvah, I went to Israel for the very first time. It was a different era. It was a moment between moments. Rabin had been assassinated 3 years earlier, but the Second Intifada would not begin for another 2. During our day in the old city, my family visited the obvious sights, but there was a place we went to today that would be impossible for tourists. Touring through the Arab quarter, we accessed the Temple Mount and then entered the Dome of the Rock. We were not allowed into its most private section, but from a distance, looking down a flight of stairs that I was not allowed to descend, I could in fact see the rock for which the dome was named. Impossibly large, unpolished, rough. It is a sacred mystery that I can still see perfectly in my mind's eye. Today, I am told, and to be fair, I've never tried, that entrance into the Dome of the Rock and the actual Mosque Al-Aqsa is only allowed if you are a Muslim. There is a short test that you need to pass, a few questions to recite a section from the Quran, the sort of thing that any Muslim with some small amount of learning can do, but seems impossible to an outsider. But this is not the only restriction on the Al-Aqsa Mosque Plaza. Prayer for any religion other than Islam is strictly forbidden today on the Temple Mount. Should you go up, the Israeli police will search your bags for religious paraphernalia and store it for you near the kotel until you return. Talitot, sidurim, tefillin, certainly a Torah. None of these things are allowed on the Temple Mount. And should you be visibly religious, for instance, such as wearing a kippah and having a beard, you are restricted to a singular path and supervised on your visit by the police. How is such a thing possible? In the Jewish state, how is such a restriction enforced? The short answer is that the administration of the plaza is handled by the Jordanian Muslim faction called the Waqf, which, on a good day, coordinates and cooperates with the IDF and the police. And while Israeli soldiers and security personnel are present at the edges, the entrances, and the gates to the Temple Mount, there is here an odd sharing of power which has seen this great and sacred location remain eternally at status quo. A status quo that, when upset, threatens panic, violence, and war. Famously, it is on the Temple Mount Plaza that Ariel Sharon, then Israel's prime minister, his presence lit the fire of the Second Intifada in the year 2000. The closing of the structure to Muslim pilgrims on Ramadan or on Friday for Jummah prayers, usually due to Israeli security concerns, causes shock waves of violence over the course of years. And Jewish Temple Mount activist, former MP Yehuda Glick, was shot and nearly assassinated in 2014 for his attempts to open the Temple Mount up to Jewish prayer on the basis of Israel's basic law, the freedom of religion. But just this week, on Tisha B'Av, the firebrand Kahanist MP Itamar Ben-Gvir went up to the Temple Mount and declared, I quote, "It needs to be said with sincerity, there is very significant progress here in the governance and in the sovereignty, and as I have said, our policy will be to enable prayer." And in the video he published, you can hear a group of Jews, young men from all the different sections of society, religious nationalists, Lithuanian, Haredi, Sephardic, settler youth, all audibly, loudly davening, shouting out the words of the Shema at the top of their lungs, throwing themselves on their faces, prostrating themselves on the stone. It is a stunning inversion and violation of what has been the norm on the Temple Mount for decades. And in the days that followed, 5 prominent ultra-Orthodox Jerusalem rabbis, including the former Sephardic rabbi, chief rabbi, Yitzchak Yosef, son of Avadia Yosef, put out a video. It is less than 2 minutes long. It is in Hebrew. But what makes the video unique is that its subtitling is not in English, nor is it in Yiddish, which is what we're used to with these sorts of communications. The subtitle for this video is in Arabic. It is a message to the Israeli Arabs to the Palestinians and to the Arab nations, and a complete denial and dismissal of Ben-Gvir, his efforts to change the status quo, and the rhetoric of his followers. In it, these 5 prominent ultra-Orthodox, perhaps the 5 most prominent ultra-Orthodox rabbis alive today, say it clearly: do not view the minister in question as representing our people Israel. He does not. Temper your spirits. We all believe in one God. We all want peace between the nations, and we cannot let radical fringes lead us into war. It is the first time, to my knowledge, that any of these 5 rabbis have ever intentionally addressed a non-Jewish audience. That alone should tell you how high the stakes are regarding the Temple Mount. But it is not, at least I don't think, the stakes that perhaps you are anticipating. Yes, these things are at stake. There is more here than just political theater. It is more than inter-party politics. It is more than an attempt to usurp or maintain the status quo. It's more than freedom of religion. In fact, I would argue that it is even greater than averting or starting a new war or a new intifada. The internal disagreement between the Jews who want to return to the right of Jewish worship on the site of the Temple Mount and the Jews who want to maintain the status quo and forbid the worship of Jewish people on the Temple Mount is about nothing less than Yemei HaMashiach, the days of the Messiah. The Temple Mount, as the name describes, was the original site of the temples in Jerusalem. And there are very strict laws about who can enter various sacred spaces, sections, locations, generally referred to as the Mikdash. Even now, 2,000 years after the building itself is gone, and now that there are buildings which are sacred to the Muslims standing in their place, these Jewish restrictions remain. And some of those laws are restricted by tribe. For instance, there are sections of the mountain where only Levites, and then amongst Levites, only Kohanim are allowed to enter. And some are restricted by time, such as you can only come in here on Shabbat, or only at certain times of day, or even only on Yom Kippur. And of course, there is a law about ritual purity, which requires not only an immersion in mikvah, but also the ashes of the red heifer to be sprinkled on you, an animal which does not exist, let alone the sacrifice being performed today. And therefore, there is a split amongst halachic authorities, some claiming that with careful intention, you can indeed identify which parts of the Temple Mount should be accessible, and those you cannot, while others engage in the long-standing tradition of placing a fence around the Torah. If you cannot figure out where to go with 100% certainty on the Temple Mount, the easiest way to avoid sinning is don't go on the Temple Mount. But what all of these authorities agree upon is that there will come a time when Jews do return to the Temple Mount, and that is in the days of the Messiah, and with the Messiah, the third and final and eternal temple. So for Ben-Gvir, who is associated with the ultra-right Kahanist movement, we actively live in messianic times. The ingathering of the exiles, the establishment of the state of Israel, the wars and victories of the state, even the suffering of the 20th century, all of these are a miraculous prelude, a precursor. They are, quote, the birth pangs of Messiah. And Ben-Gvir is not arguing only that worship for Jews at the Temple Mount should be allowed because of religious freedom. He's not only wanting to fulfill what he has said publicly, loudly, that he wants to create Jewish power. It's literally the name of his party. He is also attempting to hasten and further the arrival of the Messiah. And the reason why the 5 rabbis who reprimanded him did so such publicly is for the exact same reason. But they disagree in how it will be done. These rabbis represent the classic Ashkenaz and Sephardic ultra-Orthodox worldview, which has a very complicated relationship with the state of Israel. For them, the establishment of the state was not miraculous. In fact, it may well have been a violation of Jewish law. And for them, approaching the Temple Mount is not beckoning the divine to come closer. It is not hastening the coming of the Messiah. It is, in fact, the fundamental opposite. To them, it is sinful. It is arrogant to approach that sacred place, especially on Tisha B'Av. It invites divine disaster. And to quote Rav Kook himself, the inspiration for Messianic religious Zionism, quote, "You cannot hasten the redemption of the world through acts which are forbidden by the Torah," of which they claim ascending to the Temple Mount in an unclean state is one. The role of the good Jew then, according to these 5 rabbis, is to wait patiently, as we have for thousands of years, for God to redeem us, and then the temple will return to us. Yes, war, intifada, these things are bad. But Jews have seen war and violence for untold generation. The real issue would be accidentally pushing back the coming of the Messiah. I bring this up this Shabbat, not only because it is fascinating, not only because Israeli politics can be infuriating, but also to remind us that in Israel, the problems that the politicians bring are not always like the problems that we have here in North America. Here, we have complicated ideologies, we have differing political opinions, we have values which don't see eye to eye when it comes to the actions of our government or the choices of our ministers. But rarely are the motivations on this side of the Atlantic considered in a cosmic scale. When we evaluate the actions of our leaders, we sometimes wonder, do you believe what you are saying, or are you just saying what needs to be said? But when you discuss religious politicians and public figures in Israel, the question is never, do they believe what they say? It is always, what else needs to be said about what they believe? In 2023, in March, a few months before the students became confirmands, I took 6 of our incredible teenagers to Israel. And while we were there, we too climbed the Temple Mount, something you can only do with a modest-sized small group. And the day was both bright and overcast, and my charges, who were between 14 and 16 years old, wandered through that sacred space dressed in modest garb and acting with great respect. The tall trees of the plaza gave us shade, and the song of the bird was only disturbed by the call to prayer. The teens, I will admit, got distracted easily by the cats who have made themselves entirely at home on the sacred mountain, which is the holiest place in the world to Jews and the 3rd holiest place in the world to Muslims. We ducked beneath one of the freestanding open-air domed structures, the Dome of the Chain, to stay dry during a sudden rainstorm. And once it passed, we made our way back into the old city of Jerusalem. I asked one of them later, "What did you think? What did you think of our day on the Temple Mount? You know, it's rare to go up there. Most tour groups have too many people to go to the Temple Mount." And I also told this student about my own adventure when I was 13 and how different it was, how it used to be different, how Israel used to be different. I told them about the rock that's within the dome and the rock that we can't see anymore because we're not allowed in. And they looked at me, and they thought, and they said, profoundly, briefly, epically teenager, "Yeah, that would have been cool." And then their attention went elsewhere instantly. But it stuck with me, and I nodded, and I said, yes, I guess it would have been. It would have been so cool if I could have shown you that place in a time of peace. Sha'alu shalom Yerushalayim, yishla'u yohevecha. We pray for the well-being of Jerusalem. May all those who love you be at peace. Shabbat shalom.